guys, Frightener22 here, welcoming you back to another installment of Frightener22's Saturday Night Movie Drive-In. Well, Season 2 is here, and the season continues to trek on. With St. Patrick's Day only a few short days away, I figured it was a real no-brainer to bust out one of the more unsung horror movies of the 1990s, so we're going to be taking a look at 1993's Leprechaun. Now, I feel like the Leprechaun series in general has developed a lot of flack over the years, and I mean, you know, what can you say? It's kind of a laugh. It's a big joke by this point. I mean, it has managed to kind of garner 5 sequels in and of itself, but I mean, like, ever since from the beginning, it's always kind of been a more laughable movie, but that doesn't necessarily make it a terrible movie to watch. It's actually a lot of fun, especially when you look back to the original film. Now, the nutshell version of the plot deals with this. It takes place on this drunken Irish guy named Dan O'Grady, who appears back at his house, clearly intoxicated with alcohol, greeting his wife with, you know, tons of gold and promising her riches and mansions that she never dreamed of. So, in his drunken state, his wife pretty much asks him straight up how the hell he came across all this money, and in his drunken state, he begins to inform her that he captured Leprechaun while he was in Ireland and made the Leprechaun show him where his gold was. So he comes back with the stolen gold, and of course the Leprechaun finds him. There appears to be some kind of a struggle. His wife gets killed, and Mr. O'Grady ends up capturing the Leprechaun in a crate and putting a 4-leaf clover on it, because that's the only way that you can actually stop the Leprechaun is by the power of a 4-leaf clover. So he nails the box shut, and as he's going through the whole trouble of trying to light the house on fire, he goes and has a stroke. So after that event, the film starts to 10 years later, and you see that a father and his stuck-up daughter, played by Jennifer Aniston in her feature film debut, moves into the house while these 3 guys are painting it. This company called 3 Guys That Paint. It's this guy Nate with his little brother Alex and this guy Ozzy. And lo and behold, as they're going through the basement of the O'Grady place, they find the crate, and before you know, the Leprechaun gets loose and is hungry to try and find and reclaim his gold that was taken from him by Mr. O'Grady. So now that that's all out of the way, the film, like I said, is actually a lot of fun. I mean, I hadn't watched it it had to have been years before, I popped it out for the sake of this review, but I mean, it definitely doesn't hold up completely, but it's still a lot of fun. I mean, the best way to describe it is that it's certainly a film that's, just a great popcorn film. I mean, you're not looking at it to be blown away by, Academy Award-winning acting or screenwriting or anything like that. It's just, a good fun. It's a killer leprechaun on the loose trying to get back, his gold, and in the process knocking off a few heads. I don't see anything wrong with that plot. It sounds like a ton of fun to me. But, I mean, it is somewhat of a little dated, but the thing that kind of makes it so cool are a few things, actually. By the time of its release, 1993, the 80s have, come and gone by that point, and the horror community had kind of been going through a bit of a dive at that point once the 90s hit. And I think Wes Craven said it best once in an interview where he described, how the popularity of the horror film is just an ever going cycle where it's, for a few years it's hot and the next time it's not, and it's just this always, this always ongoing cycle within the horror community. And, if you grew up and, loved watching movies into the 80s and are still watching them well into, 2010, then you can see that cycle that Wes Craven was talking about is incredibly true. So once the 80s had kind of come and gone, the big hype of seeing slashers and sequels of horror franchises every other weekend at your local theater were kind of long gone. So by the time the 90s hit, there wasn't really much to see. I mean, films like, Child's Play and the Candyman series were really gasping their last breaths out of their franchises. But, out comes Leprechaun in 1993, and it kind of was funny because when it came out, and even to this day, I still look back on it and say, wow, 1993, it took them that long to actually take something as simplistic and obvious as, the Leprechaun and kind of the idea of, kind of taking a holiday such as St. Patrick's Day and kind of exploiting whatever that holiday had to, offer itself. I mean, the Leprechaun movie doesn't exactly take place on St. Patrick's Day, but just looking at all the holidays in a calendar and just kind of thinking how you can exploit that. So I just find it really fascinating that it took until 1993 to actually use that image of, a leprechaun and make it into a film. I mean, I'm sure it had been done, but, I think when people think about killer leprechauns, one movie really only comes to mind, and that is the 1993 Leprechaun. So I just think that's really, really cool and really, really fascinating. Furthermore, the cast in this film is actually really, really cool. I had almost forgotten that the guy that plays Ozzy is, he's a great, great talent. You guys would remember him by he played Francis in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and in Leprechaun, he's more or less playing the Francis role again. He's just pretty much, a little kid trapped in a big, a man's body, and plays really, really well. The younger brother, played by Alex, is another kid that I actually liked a lot. He acted in one of my favorite 90s movies of all time, 1991's Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. And of course you get, the fun role of seeing, somebody as A-listing now as Jennifer Aniston, way back when she started her career playing, a role in a horror film, top-lined by a killer leprechaun, who, might I add, is played by the wonderful Warwick Davis. I know a lot of people recognize him mainly from Leprechaun, but before that, he was also Willow in the Ron Howard directed film Willow, which is a phenomenal fantasy film. If you guys haven't seen that one out, check that one out. Warwick Davis and Val Kilmer star in it. It's just a terrific, terrific film. But this film overall, it is a great film, but like I said, over the years it's developed a lot of flack. There's been 5 entries in it. In my personal opinion, Leprechaun 2 and 3 are where it's still really, really fun in the series, but by part 4, they put Leprechaun in space, and depending on your taste of films, you can think, oh, wow, that's so bad, it's good, but in my personal opinion, it's really so bad that it's bad. I mean, it's just not an enjoyable B movie to really watch. I'm actually really bored and frustrated during that movie. And then, of course, you got Leprechaun going to the hood, and, he is top line, he's starring with Ice-T in the film as well. But then by Leprechaun 6, they didn't really get too unique there. It's just Leprechaun back to the hood, and I'll admit I've only seen probably about half that film because I fell asleep to it, and that pretty much can tell you, the quality of that kind of movie. But what I can say on the, modest budget that they actually had on these films, you can see that if they were going to keep making Leprechaun films, you can just see that the makeup design was, a constant, process that they were willing to change up just to make it more and more interesting. And I do kind of admire the makers of each of those films for doing that, because, when you watch Leprechaun 1 and then you actually hark back to Leprechaun Back to the Hood, you can see that Leprechaun is, has long hair, and, just his face is slightly different. So it's kind of cool to see this character, visually change over the course of time, unlike slashers like Freddy, who really didn't change at all. Not that that's a bad thing, but it just, it's cool to see a new movie and just see that they kind of have a variation on their look, which is a lot of fun. Not too many interesting notes to add to this, but this was actually the first film that the company Trimarks had put out, and surprisingly enough, this film actually sold 100,000 videos during the VHS boom. So, I mean, in my opinion, I'm not sure if that's a really record-breaking number, but that was a fact that I pulled out. So if they were, through my sources, if that was, a fact that was willing to put down on paper, then I guess that must have been a pretty impressive number for a film like Leprechaun. Now, Leprechaun's been more or less in retirement ever since Leprechaun Back to the Hood, which debuted in the early 2000s, but, I think it's kind of like I think it's probably the best time to bring it back. I mean, if they're revisiting things like Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger and, remakes of, Child's Play and Hellraiser on the way, why not revisit Leprechaun? Darren Lynn Bousman, director of Saws 2 through 4, actually was quoted stating in an interview that he would love to see a new Leprechaun movie. And I think the best way to start is the way that Darren Lynn Bousman had suggested. I think that setting him in the Wild Wild West during the Gold Rush would be a terrific way to bring this, to bring Leprechaun back into the mainstream. I mean, if a company like Lionsgate made that film and maybe even made it as like a direct-to-video film but just had a pretty decent budget, I think that it could be a lot of fun. It's definitely worth a shot, so hopefully somebody gets smart and decides to, re-inject a second life into the Leprechaun franchise. Well, guys, thanks again for tuning in. This is Frightener22.